This video is to demonstrate joining a new square to an existing square. So the first square was this pink one, and then the orange square has been knitted to it, and it's been joined to the right hand side of the existing square. When you're joining squares, you need to think about the direction the mitre is going, and in this particular method I want the mitre in the new square to point in the same direction as the original square. So as you can see, this is the original decreasing mitre, and here is the start of the mitre, and the decrease is pointing in the same direction in the second square. To add a square to the right hand side, you have to cast on stitches first and then pick up stitches. These squares are 22 stitches cast on initially, so to start we have to cast on half the stitches, 11, and then we have to pick up 11 up the edge of the existing square. In best Blue Peter fashion, I have one already started, so I'm going to add a new square to this edge of the existing square. We need to cast on half the number of stitches, which in this case is 11, and again we're using the same cast on as you use for the original basic square, which is the knit cast on. So you need to cast on, place slip knot on your left needle and cast on 11 stitches. So I just check that I've got 11 stitches. So that's the half of the square cast on. I can now put my right needle down and put the needle with the stitches into my right hand, and then I'm holding the square I want to join to in my left hand. And when I'm joining to the right hand side of this square, I want to pick up from the cast on edge up to the point. I've got a nice chain selvage along this edge, so I know that I can pick up one stitch for each chain up this edge to get my 11 stitches. So I come to the bottom here, and the very first one can sometimes be a little difficult to make sure you get both sides of the chain. So I'm going under both sides of the first chain, and take the yarn around the point of the needle to make a new stitch. One of the things you can do while picking up stitches up the edge is to also weave in the end, the tail end, from the previous square, so that you don't have to sew it in at the end. So I'm going to do that at the same time as I pick up my stitches. So I'm going to go in to the next chain, under the next chain, and also lift this yarn over the needle, but make sure I move it out of the way, so I don't want to knit it through the stitch, I only want to knit the working yarn. And then I'm going to go into the next chain, and with the yarn held down at the back I'm going to knit the next stitch. So the weaving in action is a 2-stitch action. into the next stitch, lift the yarn up, or you can just drape it over the top, hold it across the right needle so it holds at the front, take the yarn around, pull the stitch through, and then drop it to the back, hold it down at the back while you make your next stitch. If you can learn to hold the tail in your left hand, it just becomes a much smoother movement. I lifted it up, yarn round needle, pull the new stitch through, hold it down. So as I pick up one stitch for each chain up this edge, I can weave in my tail end at the same time. And you usually, it does vary a little bit on the yarns, but usually about 8 to 10 stitches is sufficient to hold that yarn securely for future use. Right, so I've got, this is the very last one, which is always a little bit more difficult, and this one I tend to only pick up the front. That's the actual chain. I tend to only pick up the front of the chain with this one at the top, but if you prefer you can go under both. It doesn't make any significant difference. So that's should be my 22 stitches. 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22. So I had 11 stitches cast on and 11 stitches knitted up. And that is row 1 of the pattern. I'm now going to start row 2 of the pattern, which is knit 1 through the back loop, knit to 1 stitch before the centre. It may well tell you in the pattern the exact number of stitches you have to work. On this very first one, it's usually fairly easy to see because you get a little gap between the stitch that was knitted up and the cast on stitch. So those are the centre 2 stitches. I now knit those 2 together, so I've done 1 decrease to give me my odd number of stitches. Also knitting those 2 together closes any little gap that may appear at that point, and then I knit to the end of the row to the last stitch, yarn forward, slip 1 purlwise. So if you're following the pattern, that's row 2 of the pattern. You would now continue following your pattern to work another square in exactly the same way as the first square. The decrease will come at this centre point here, so that your square will now sit in this shape. So if I just bring back the previous sample, that was my original square. So at the moment, although it doesn't look the same, when it's completed, these stitches will actually be those stitches there. So you now complete that square in exactly the same way as before to attach a new square to the right hand side of an existing square.